You have been trained to read a landscape the way other men read a sentence. 3 years at an artillery observation school outside Uterbog taught you to break a tree line into sectors, to know that a hedgerow gap of a certain width will funnel infantry into a column, to recognize the particular stillness that means men are waiting rather than absent. You have learned to hold a Zeiss scissor telescope steady against a tripod for 40 minutes without your arm shaking, to log azimuth and range in a grid book with numbers that will, in seconds, become a rain of steel 2 kilometers behind you. Above all, you have learned patience. Your instructors told you more than once that the amateur reveals himself by firing at the first target he sees. The professional waits for the target that matters. It is late November 1944, in the flooded, splintered pine of the Huichin forest, on the German side of a line that has barely moved in 3 weeks despite thousands of dead on both sides of it. You are dug into a scrape beneath the shattered crown of a fir tree, your field telephone wire trailing back through the mud to a battery of 105s a kilometer to your rear. Your orders are simple and absolute. Observe, do not reveal your position for anything less than a target worth the exposure, and never, under any circumstances, call fire on a target you have not personally verified through the glass. Your rule, the one drilled into you until it replaced instinct, is this: a real assault comes with real signs, engine noise building in layers, vehicle dispersal patterns, radio traffic bleeding through on captured frequencies, men moving with the discipline of units that intend to hold ground. A single squad wandering into a clearing proves nothing. You have seen Americans send exactly that kind of bait before, and you have learned to let it pass. Then, through the fogged optics, you see it. A squad-sized element breaking from the tree line 200 meters out, moving in the loose, tired shuffle of men who have been in the line too long, dragging what looks like a mortar tube and carrying ammunition crates between them the way exhausted men carry things. Badly, unevenly, complaining with their bodies if not their voices. Behind them, engine noise. Not one engine. Several layered, the low grind of half-tracks idling somewhere out of sight, the particular double note of a Sherman's twin exhaust. It reads, in every detail your training has taught you to weigh, as the leading edge of a company preparing to push the position at first dark. You watch for 4 minutes. You watch for the discipline that would tell you it's staged and you don't see it. The squad in the clearing digs in badly, the way real infantry digs in when they are tired and scared and mean to stay. This is what you were trained to wait for. This is the target that justifies breaking cover. You lift the phone, call in the grid, and adjust your battery onto the mortar crew and the tree line behind them. Fire falls, accurate, exactly where you sent it. And in the 11 seconds between your first correction and your second, a spotting team 400 meters to your flank, men who have been watching you rather than your target the entire time, reads your muzzle flash location off a sound-ranging board, radios a grid of their own to a waiting battery of American 155s, and ends your observation post before your second correction ever leaves your mouth. The squad in the clearing was 3 riflemen and a radio operator running a recorded engine loop off a captured Wehrmacht amplifier salvaged from a supply depot near Aachen. The mortar tube had no base plate. It had never been fired and never would be. Nothing you saw was real except the men, and even they were never your actual target. You were. This is a story about a discipline so good it became a liability, and a trick so old that the men who used it in 1944 had, in most cases, no idea they were repeating something their grandfather's war had already proven. It is a story about how you make a professional reveal himself, not by matching his skill, but by understanding, more precisely than he understands himself, exactly what he has been trained to trust. German artillery officers who survived encounters like the one above had a word for it afterward, one that shows up again and again in post-war interviews and staff debriefs: unerklärlich, inexplicable, not because the trick was complicated, because it wasn't, and that was the part they couldn't forgive themselves for missing. So how did American infantrymen with no formal deception training, no dedicated equipment, and often only a few hours to plan, consistently manage to pull some of the most disciplined artillery observers in the world out of hiding? And what does the persistence of that same basic maneuver, unchanged in its essentials, across 100 years of warfare, tell us about the limits of even the finest training a system can produce? To understand why this worked, you first have to understand why it should not have. The German Wehrmacht's Artillery Observation Corps was, by 1944, arguably the most technically refined forward observation system fielded by any army in the war. It had grown out of a doctrinal lesson the German military establishment had absorbed with total seriousness after the First World War: that artillery, properly directed, was worth more than infantry numbers, and that the officer directing it, the Vorgeschobene Beobachter, the forward observer, was the single most valuable node on the battlefield, more valuable in many tactical situations than the guns themselves. The terrain of the autumn and winter 1944 campaigns in the West rewarded this doctrine almost perfectly. The Huichen Forest, the hedgerow country of Normandy that preceded it, and later the wooded ridgelands of the Ardennes were landscapes of short sightlines and constrained movement, where a single well-placed observer with a radio or field telephone could dominate a kilometer of front that no rifleman could see across. German officers frequently described the forest fighting as a war fought less between infantry lines than between an infantry force trying to move and an unseen eye trying to stop it. In terrain like this, the observer was not a supporting element. He was the primary weapon. German forward observers trained at dedicated artillery schools, Jüterbog and Grossborn among the most prominent, where the curriculum went well beyond mathematics. Officers were drilled in what amounted to applied psychology of the battlefield: how to distinguish a genuine unit in contact from a diversion, how long to observe before committing a fire mission, how to weight conflicting sensory evidence. Training manuals of the period emphasized several explicit rules that observers were expected to internalize as reflex rather than checklist. First, no single sensory cue, visual, auditory, or otherwise, was sufficient justification for a fire mission. Corroborating signs were required. Second, exposure of an observation post was to be treated as a resource to be spent, never wasted on a target of ambiguous value, because a compromised op meant the loss not just of a man, but of the eyes for an entire battery. Third, and most consequential for what would happen to men like the one in the opening scene, patience itself was framed as a weapon. The observer who waited longest for verification was the observer least likely to be deceived and most likely to deliver fire that actually mattered. A representative figure of this system, not any single documented individual, but a composite drawn from the training records, unit histories, and post-war debriefs of dozens of forward observers who served in the same divisions across the same campaigns, might have completed 18 months of artillery school before ever reaching the front, followed by a rotation through progressively more exposed observation postings, from rear area registration work to, eventually, forward positions embedded within or just ahead of the infantry line. Such an officer would typically have directed dozens of confirmed fire missions by the autumn of 1944, developed a personal reputation within his division for the precision of his corrections, and been trusted by battery commanders to call fire close enough to friendly positions that a less experienced observer would not have been permitted to attempt it. This was, by any honest measure, an elite arm of a modern military, not simply competent, but among the most professionally refined observation forces then in existence. The German army also maintained a rough institutional hierarchy of trust for its observers, tied loosely to seniority and confirmed mission count rather than a formal badge system. Though unit citations and mentions in divisional after-action reports served an equivalent function, marking certain officers as men whose fire corrections could be acted on with minimal secondary verification from the battery itself. A meaningful institutional shortcut in a service where speed of response often determined whether a fire mission arrived in time to matter. The system worked exactly as designed with brutal regularity. Divisional after-action language from the Huichin fighting describes American rifle companies pinned for hours by artillery fire directed from positions their own men never located. Observation posts tucked into church towers, quarry faces, and the crowns of the tallest surviving trees, invisible until the guns had already done their work and the observer had already displaced. One American regimental history from the period describes a single German observer, never identified or captured, who is credited across divisional records with directing fire that stalled 3 separate company-level advances over a period of roughly 2 weeks before American counter-battery finally silenced the sector. An illustration, from the American side, of precisely how effective the system was meant to be, and generally was. Captured German artillery personnel, when interrogated by Allied intelligence teams later in the campaign, described their own rules of engagement in terms that align closely with the surviving training doctrine. A fire mission was something you earned the right to call, not something you reached for reflexively, because a battery only had so many rounds and a division only had so many usable observation positions, and wasting either on an uncertain target was, in the words attributed to more than one prisoner in summary reports, worse than firing on nothing at all. This was the system American infantrymen were up against, not a sloppy or improvised force, but one of the most methodical observation networks fielded in the European theater. And this is precisely why the trick that beat it, when it worked so completely. It did not outskill the German observer. It exploited the exact quality that made him dangerous in the first place. The specific mechanism, staged movement and sound paired with a hidden counter-observation team, waiting for the enemy spotter to expose himself by firing, was not new in 1944, and the soldiers who used it in the Huichin and later in the Ardennes were, in nearly every documented case, unaware they were repeating a tactic with roots stretching back at least 2 full generations of warfare. Its most direct ancestor lived in the artillery duels of the Western Front during the First World War, and specifically in the counter-battery techniques developed by British and Commonwealth forces from 1916 onward. German artillery in that war, like German artillery in the next one, was superbly disciplined and difficult to locate, dug into camouflaged positions and firing in short, unpredictable bursts, specifically to deny Allied gunners the sustained signature needed to triangulate a battery's position. The British answer, refined most famously in the lead-up to Vimy Ridge in 1917, combined 2 technical innovations: flash spotting, in which observers at known surveyed positions along the line timed and triangulated the visual flash of enemy guns firing, and sound ranging, in which microphones spaced along the front recorded the distinct acoustic signature of a shell's discharge, and used the tiny differences in arrival time between stations to calculate a firing position with startling precision, in ideal conditions to within a few dozen meters. But both techniques shared the same fundamental limitation. They required the enemy gun to fire. A perfectly disciplined German battery that simply refused to shoot was invisible to both systems. The British solution to that problem was to make refusal to fire more costly than firing. Units began staging what soldiers of the period called Chinese attacks, barrages, feints, and controlled infantry movements designed to look, from the German side of the line, exactly like the opening moves of a genuine assault, without any intention of actually attacking. A convincing enough feint put a German battery commander in an impossible position. Fire, and reveal the position his flash spotters and sound rangers were waiting to locate, or hold silent, and risk a real assault landing on his own infantry with no artillery support at all. Regimental gunnery diaries from the Arras sector in early 1917 describe exactly this dynamic. Batteries drawn into premature fire by staged movement, their positions logged and marked for destruction within hours of exposing themselves. A slower, more industrial cousin of what would happen to a lone German observer in a Huichin tree line 27 years later, but recognizably the same trap. Force the disciplined party to choose between exposure and irrelevance, and let discipline itself do the rest. The lineage runs deeper still, into a form of the same basic principle that predates modern artillery observation altogether: the use of deliberately staged force, rather than staged movement, to manipulate an opposing commander's judgment. During the American Civil War, Confederate forces at Centerville, Virginia, in the winter of 1861 and into early 1862, famously mounted painted and shaped logs on their fortification lines in place of scarce artillery pieces, a deception that came to be known, with some affection from the soldiers who later admitted to building them, as Quaker guns, after the pacifist sect whose members famously declined to carry weapons at all. Union reconnaissance parties observing the position from a distance, unwilling to risk a close approach that might have exposed the ruse, reported the position as heavily fortified and defensible, a judgment that contributed to a Union delay in advancing on the position for weeks. The Confederate defenders eventually withdrew of their own accord, the deception never directly tested by assault, but the episode entered military folklore as an early, almost primitive demonstration of a principle that would recur, refined and specialized, for the next century and beyond. An observer's trained judgment can be manipulated more efficiently by giving him exactly what his training tells him to look for than by trying to hide from his judgment altogether. What had not crossed, in either of those earlier wars, was the final piece that made the 1944 version so lethal: the combination of staged bait specifically engineered to satisfy an observer's own doctrine, with a dedicated, silent counter-observation element positioned not to watch the bait, but to watch the man watching the bait. The First World War's Sound Rangers waited passively for any gun to fire. The Civil War's Quaker guns were never designed to provoke a response at all, only to discourage one. The Huichin forest trick fused both ideas into something considerably sharper: manufacture the exact evidentiary threshold the enemy observer's training required him to wait for, then use his own compliance with that threshold as the signal that would kill him. To understand precisely why this worked, it helps to separate the mechanism into its two working parts: what it presented to the observer and what it did with his reaction. The signal the German observer was trained to key on was never a single detail, but a convergence of them. Layered engine noise suggesting multiple vehicles rather than one, human movement with the loose but persistent quality of men settling rather than passing through, and equipment handling consistent with a unit preparing a position rather than probing one. No individual piece of this picture needed to be genuine. What mattered was that the convergence itself, the thing his doctrine explicitly told him to wait for before every other kind of evidence, arrived all at once, manufactured specifically to satisfy the threshold his training had spent 18 months building in him. This is the precise doctrinal instinct that got weaponized against its own owner: patience, verification, and the refusal to act on a single ambiguous cue. An observer trained to fire at the first thing he saw would have been nearly impossible to bait this way, because his fire discipline would have been too erratic to predict or exploit. He might fire on a genuinely empty clearing, wasting a mission on nothing, or he might hold fire on something real out of habitual caution. It was precisely the well-trained observer, the one who had internalized the rule that verification matters, who could be relied upon to wait for exactly the kind of convergent, multi-source evidence a decoy team could learn to fabricate. The system's greatest strength, its insistence on corroborated evidence before commitment, became, in the hands of men willing to manufacture that corroboration, a predictable trigger rather than a safeguard. The supporting method that let American units capitalize on that triggered reaction was, in most documented instances, remarkably low technology. Forward infantry teams equipped with little more than field glasses, a working knowledge of muzzle flash and smoke signature recognition, and a field telephone or radio link back to a waiting battery, essentially replicating in miniature, and by eye, what the British sound ranging network had done mechanically a generation earlier. Where resources allowed, American units paired this with genuine counterbattery radar and sound-ranging assets already organic to divisional artillery, giving the decoy technique a second, more technical layer of confirmation once the German gun or mortar fired. The core exploit, though, required nothing more sophisticated than patience matched against patience, and the willingness to lose a controlled, minor exposure, 3 riflemen and a recorded engine loop, in exchange for the much larger prize of the observer who would otherwise have gone on directing fire against real advances for weeks. The clearest way to state the inversion at the heart of the trick is this: the German observation system was built to win a contest of skill against an enemy trying to hide or trying to attack honestly, a symmetric contest, expertise against expertise, discipline against discipline, in which the better trained side would reliably prevail. American infantry units, lacking anything close to equivalent formal observation training, refused that contest entirely. They did not try to outwatch the German observer. They gave him something to watch, on their own terms, and let his own rules do the rest of the work. The technique surfaces across the ETO campaign with enough consistency and enough local variation that it is better understood as a widely adopted improvisational method than as any single unit signature trick. In the hedgerow country south of Normandy during the summer of 1944, the terrain itself made staged movement almost too easy to arrange. The dense, compartmentalized fields separated by earthen banks and thick hedges limited German observers to a handful of viable vantage points per sector, usually the taller farm buildings or the rare elevated crossroads, which meant American infantry could often predict, with reasonable confidence, exactly where an observer watching a given field was likely to be positioned. Units operating in this terrain adapted the trick to smaller scale. Rather than staging an entire squad's worth of noise and movement, a 2- or 3-man team would deliberately expose itself crossing a hedgerow gap at a pace and posture calculated to look like point men for a larger advance, while a second team, positioned along the most likely observation line, watched for muzzle flash or radio antenna movement from the suspected vantage point. An after-action account from the 29th Infantry Division's push toward St. Lo describes exactly this kind of paired maneuver being used to locate and eliminate observation posts in church towers and farmhouse attics that had stalled advances for days, with a period photograph later archived in divisional records showing the collapsed remains of one such tower, credited in the caption to counter-battery fire called in after the position gave itself away responding to a staged crossing. On the Anzio beachhead in Italy, the terrain problem ran in the opposite direction. The Allied lodgment sat on flat, low ground overlooked almost entirely by German observers dug into the Alban Hills to the northeast, positions so commanding that German artillery could range nearly the entire beachhead at will, a situation American and British troops on the ground described at the time as living under constant, unblinking observation. Static bait, a fake troop concentration or a decoy vehicle park, was harder to sustain here because German observers had weeks, not minutes, to study the terrain and learn to distinguish genuine unit movement from staged activity. Units at Anzio instead leaned more heavily on radio deception, running dummy traffic on frequencies known to be monitored, timed to coincide with genuine but minor vehicle repositioning, creating a layered signal that combined real movement with false intent. When German batteries fired on the resulting apparent buildup, the flat, open terrain of the beachhead, normally a liability, became an asset for counter-battery work, giving Allied sound ranging and spotter aircraft an unusually clean line on the muzzle flash of guns dug into the hills above. In the Huichin forest itself, beyond the specific encounter described at the outset, the technique appears repeatedly in divisional records from the 4th and 28th Infantry Divisions through October and November of 1944, adapted to the dense, close canopy terrain by pairing staged ground-level movement with controlled use of smoke, intended to suggest a unit consolidating a newly won position. Precisely the kind of target German doctrine treated as worth the risk of committing observed fire against, because a consolidating unit, unlike a probing patrol, represented ground that could still be contested if struck quickly. It is within this specific pattern of Huichin fighting that the war's cost is most starkly visible. Private First Class Walter Ostrowski, 19 years old, of the 28th Infantry Division, was killed by German artillery fire on the 11th of November, 1944, during a staged consolidation maneuver near the village of Wassenack, intended to draw exactly this kind of observed response. The decoy worked precisely as designed, exposing and leading to the destruction of the observation post that had fired on his position. But not before the mission's own controlled exposure cost his life. His name appears in the division's casualty rolls for that date, one line among hundreds, a reminder that even a successful application of the trick carried a real and calculated price, paid in advance by men who could not know, when they moved into the open, whether the fire that answered them would be the last fire the German observer ever called. By the time the same basic technique reappears in accounts from the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, American units in the Ardennes using staged campfires, vehicle noise, and controlled patrol movement along key road junctions to draw German observers watching for exactly the kind of buildup that would signal an Allied counterattack forming. It had become something closer to standard improvisational practice than to any individual unit's clever idea. Passed unit to unit less through formal doctrine than through the informal transmission of soldiers who had seen it work and told the next company over. None of these applications required the trick to succeed every time. A staged bait that drew fire from a German observer 9 times out of 10 and revealed nothing useful on the 10th was still, from the perspective of a division fighting for every mile of forest and hedgerow, a resounding net gain. The arithmetic of attritional warfare rarely rewards the perfect solution. It rewards the one that tilts the exchange rate, even slightly, and does so reliably enough to matter across dozens of repetitions along a long front over many weeks. Corroboration for how well the technique actually worked comes, tellingly, from the German side itself. Interrogation summaries compiled by Allied intelligence teams from captured artillery officers and forward observers taken prisoner in the Huichin and Ardennes fighting describe, with a consistency that surprised the interrogators compiling the reports, officers who acknowledged having been drawn into firing on what turned out to be staged movement, and who described the experience less with anger than with a kind of professional bewilderment. The sense that they had done exactly what their training told them to do, and that doing so had been the mistake. Post-war interviews and unit histories compiled by German veterans in the decades following the war echo the same theme, several describing forward observers within their own units who grew visibly more hesitant to commit fire missions as the 1944 campaign wore on, not because their nerve had failed, but because they had begun to suspect, correctly, that the very evidence their doctrine told them to trust was being manufactured against them. This is corroborating evidence of the most convincing kind, not American accounts of a trick working, but German accounts of a trick they could not, in the moment, distinguish from the real thing their own training had taught them to identify. We tell ourselves, when we talk about how the war in the West was won, a story built from big, legible pieces, industrial output outproducing German factories 2 and 3 to 1, air superiority that eventually strangled German fuel and rail movement, overwhelming numbers of men and machines fed into a front the Wehrmacht could no longer reinforce fast enough to hold. These explanations are true, and they matter, and no honest account of the campaign can leave them out. But underneath them, at the level of a single forest clearing or a single hedgerow gap, the war was also won by something much smaller and much harder to put in a production chart. The accumulated effect of thousands of individually minor decisions by junior officers and enlisted men who understood, correctly, that the fastest way to defeat a superbly disciplined observer was not to become a better observer than him, but to become a more convincing illusion than his training had prepared him to doubt. This is the closed system versus open system argument at the heart of the story, and it deserves to be stated plainly rather than left implied. The German Artillery Observation Corps was, in the most literal sense, a closed system, a body of doctrine, developed over years at institutions like Jüterbog, tested and refined, and passed down through a formal chain of instruction, designed to produce consistent, reliable judgment across hundreds of officers spread across a continent-wide front. Its strength was exactly that consistency. An observer trained at Jüterbog in 1943 would apply the same evidentiary standard in the Huichin forest in 1944 that his instructors had drilled into him. And that consistency is precisely what made German artillery observation so lethally effective for most of the war. But a closed system cannot update itself in the field, not quickly, not at the level of the individual observer facing a genuinely novel deception for the first time. His doctrine could not tell him, in the moment, that this specific convergence of engine noise and troop movement was fabricated, because his doctrine had been built to recognize genuine convergence, not to doubt convergence itself. The American infantrymen who ran these decoys, by contrast, were operating in something much closer to an open system, improvised, informally transmitted, adjusted on the fly by men with no institutional stake in doing it the way it had always been done, because for most of them there was no always to refer back to. They could fail, adapt, and try a slightly different version of the same basic idea the next week, unconstrained by a manual that told them what evidence should or should not be trusted. This is not a claim that American forces were, as people, cleverer or braver than their German counterparts. The men on both sides of these encounters were, by every honest measure, professionals operating near the limit of what their training and circumstances allowed. It is a claim about the structural difference between a system built for consistency and a system built for adaptation, and about which of those two structures proves more dangerous when a genuinely novel trick appears on the battlefield for the first time. This is also, finally, the full weight behind the word German survivors reached for afterward. Unerklärlich, inexplicable, was not the word of a defeated force describing a superior enemy technique, in the way a soldier might describe better tanks or heavier artillery. It was the word of men trying to describe the experience of having done everything correctly, by every standard their years of training had given them, and having that correctness be the precise thing that killed them. There is no German military term that captures being defeated by your own competence rather than by someone else's superior skill, and so the observers who survived reached, again and again in post-war accounts, for the same inadequate, honest word, inexplicable, not because the trick was mysterious, because their own training had made it impossible for them to see it coming, and no vocabulary existed yet for a defeat like that. The mechanism did not disappear with the war that produced its most refined wartime form. Variants of the same basic principle manufacture the exact evidentiary threshold a disciplined observer requires, then exploit his compliance with his own standard, have recurred in nearly every conflict since where one side has possessed a technically superior observation or targeting system, and the other has not. Vietnam-era accounts describe American and Allied forces using staged radio traffic and controlled troop movement to draw North Vietnamese and Viet Cong observers and mortar teams into revealing positions, echoing the Huichin pattern in jungle terrain rather than forest. More recently, open-source accounts and journalistic reporting from conflicts within the past 2 decades, including asymmetric fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, describe insurgent forces and, in later conflicts, more conventional armies alike using decoy movement, staged vehicle convoys, and deliberately exposed communications to draw fire from technically superior drone and artillery observation systems, forcing the more advanced side to reveal a sensor's location or a targeting cell's procedure, by giving it exactly the kind of convergent evidence its own targeting doctrine required before authorizing a strike. The specific technology changes with every generation, telephone wire to radio to satellite uplink, tree line observation post to drone feed. But the underlying exploit does not, because it was never really a trick about equipment. It was always a trick about how trained judgment works, and trained judgment, however its tools evolve, is still built on the same basic human need to see enough evidence before acting. That need is not going away, and neither, it seems, is the appeal of giving someone exactly the evidence they're waiting for. The verdict, stated plainly, is this: the German Artillery Observation Corps had, by nearly every objective measure, the better doctrine, more rigorous training, more disciplined fire procedures, a more technically refined understanding of how to direct artillery with lethal precision across difficult terrain. The American infantrymen who defeated individual observers again and again through 1944 did not have a better doctrine. They had a better answer, arrived at not through formal training, but through the simple, repeated recognition that the most disciplined man on the battlefield is also, if you understand his discipline well enough, the most predictable one. Somewhere in a forest that has long since regrown over the scars of November 1944, the ground still holds the outline of a scrape beneath a shattered tree, empty now, indistinguishable to any casual observer from 100 others nearby. Nothing marks it as the place where a man who had trained for years to see clearly was finally undone by exactly what he had been trained to see. The trick that found him needed no tanks and no aircraft, and no signal that a historian could point to on a map with real confidence. It needed only the patience to wait until his own patience gave him away. If this story changed how you think about who really wins a war, please subscribe and like the channel. We are excavating the history that time tried to bury.